Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone." Sophie Harwood sat by the attic window, her knees drawn up to her chest, as the last rays of sunlight brushed against her pale face. The old glass distorted the world outside, yet the truth had never been clearer. She wasn't a guest in her aunt and uncle's mansion. She wasn't even family. She was a debt, an inconvenient burden waiting to be sold off like unwanted furniture. It had been 7 months since her parents died in that violent car crash on a rainy Friday afternoon. The news came with a knock on the door, and 2 solemn police officers who wouldn't meet her gaze. Sophie, only 19, crumpled to the floor, clutching the last photograph of her smiling mother and father, as if it could somehow bring them back. Her world collapsed in a single heartbeat. She was sent to live with her mother's sister, Clara Harwood, and her wealthy husband, Edward. On the surface, the Langley estate in Connecticut was beautiful. Gilded chandeliers, spotless marble floors, staff moving like ghosts. But the warmth was fake, and so were the smiles. From the moment Sophie arrived, she was made to feel like a charity case. "She doesn't fit here," Clara whispered one evening, thinking Sophie couldn't hear. "She eats like a bird and takes up an entire room. You know what we could do with that space?" Edward replied, sipping his brandy. Sophie quickly learned to be silent, invisible, a ghost in a mansion full of life she could never be part of. But nothing could have prepared her for the night she was called to the study. Edward sat behind his grand oak desk, fingers steepled, his face an emotionless mask. Clara stood beside him, lips painted in a shade too dark for her face, like a stain that wouldn't wash away. "We've made a decision, Sophie," Clara said, adjusting her pearls. "It's time you earned your place here." Sophie's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "You're going to be married," Edward announced, flipping a page in a folder he hadn't bothered to hide. Sophie stared at them, frozen. "Married to whom?" "To someone who values tradition, someone who understands responsibility." "Victor Langley," Clara said with a cold smile. The name hit Sophie like a stone in her chest. She had heard it whispered in society circles. A billionaire, reclusive, nearly 50, ruthless in business. Rumors surrounded him like smoke. One failed marriage, no children, a heart as cold as the fortune he built. Sophie's breath quickened. "I don't even know him. I'm only 19. I don't want to get married." Clara's expression hardened. "This isn't about what you want, Sophie. Your uncle and I have debts. Consider this, your contribution to the family." "You're selling me," Sophie said, the words bitter on her tongue. Edward didn't flinch. "You're being given a life most girls in your position would beg for. You'll want for nothing. Security, luxury, misery." Sophie interrupted, standing up, her voice trembled but held steady. "You're selling me to a man older than my father was when he died." Edward stood slowly, walking toward her with the calm menace of a man used to being obeyed. "You will marry Victor Langley in 2 weeks. There will be a ceremony. The papers are ready. All you need to do is say, 'I do.'" Sophie's hands clenched into fists. "You won't." "You will," Clara said coldly. "Or we'll send you to a group home. No college, no future, no protection. Your parents are gone, Sophie. This is all you have." The words cut deeper than they intended. Sophie swallowed the rising tide of anger and humiliation. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of them. "I'll leave. I'll run away," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And go where?" Edward asked. "You have nothing. You are nothing without us." That night, Sophie didn't sleep. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, as if it could offer answers. Her mind raced, heart pounding with panic. Could she escape? Was there anyone she could turn to? But the truth was cruel. She had no one. Her parents had been only children. Her friends had drifted away after the funeral, uncomfortable with grief they couldn't fix. So, 2 weeks later, in a gown that didn't feel like hers, wearing shoes that pinched her toes and a veil that made it hard to breathe, Sophie walked down an aisle lined with roses she hadn't chosen. The ceremony was private, elegant, and entirely hollow. No friends, no laughter, only silence, and the weight of a contract signed with trembling hands. Victor Langley stood at the altar like a statue, tall, composed, silver streaks in his dark hair, his face unreadable. He didn't smile when he saw her. He didn't frown either. He simply observed, his eyes cool and calculating, as if evaluating a business acquisition. Sophie's legs felt like they might give way. Her voice was barely a whisper when she said, "I do." The ring on her finger was heavy. The kiss was polite, brief, and dry. And just like that, she was no longer Sophie Harwood. She was Mrs. Sophie Langley. Later that night, as the limousine rolled toward the estate she now legally belonged to, Sophie kept her gaze fixed on the dark window. The city lights blurred into lines of gold and sorrow. Her new husband sat beside her, silent, exuding power like a storm waiting to break. She didn't know what awaited her behind those massive doors of the Langley mansion. She didn't know if he would touch her, if he would own her, if she would ever feel human again. But one thing was certain. She had just entered a cage that sparkled like a palace. And every breath she took felt like a countdown. To what? She didn't know. But the night was just beginning. The Langley mansion loomed like a fortress against the dark sky, its windows faintly glowing, as if the building itself were watching. Sophie stood in the grand foyer, her fingers clenched around the bouquet she no longer remembered holding. Her heart thundered in her chest, not from joy, but from something colder, something closer to dread. The wedding had ended just hours ago, and now she was here. A married woman, barely 19, bound to a man she didn't know, didn't trust, and couldn't read. Victor Langley. He had barely spoken to her during the ceremony or the drive to the estate. He only offered polite nods and sharp glances, his voice quiet, distant, almost mechanical. Yet, there was something behind his silence, something unreadable in his dark gray eyes. Power, sadness, or worse, indifference. Sophie's heels echoed as she was led through the hallway by a maid dressed in gray. The woman didn't smile, didn't speak. She simply gestured toward a double door at the end of the corridor. "Your room, madam," she said before vanishing as quickly as she appeared. Sophie hesitated. Her room? Not our room. Before she could think too much, the door behind her creaked. She turned sharply. Victor stood there. No jacket, sleeves rolled up, collar loosened, as if he had already shed the formality of the day. He didn't look menacing, but his presence filled the hallway like a storm front. Sophie's pulse raced. Every childhood tale, every whispered warning, every fear that had plagued her mind since the engagement hit her like a wave. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a step back, colliding softly with the doorframe. He noticed and paused. "I'm not here to hurt you," Victor said simply. His voice wasn't cold. It was calm, deep, with a hint of something restrained beneath it. Sophie said nothing. He studied her for a moment before gesturing toward the door. "This is your space. You're free to lock it if you want." Her breath hitched. His tone wasn't demanding, not cruel, but the offer caught her off guard. She opened the door slowly. The room inside was enormous, softly lit with golden sconces. The bed, king-sized and untouched, stood in the center beneath a velvet canopy. A small fire crackled in the hearth. The air smelled faintly of lavender. Sophie stepped inside, her movements unsure. She turned to see Victor still standing in the doorway, his hand resting against the frame, his eyes never leaving hers. "I won't come in unless you invite me," he said quietly. "This house is yours as much as mine, but your body, your space, will always be yours." Sophie's throat tightened. She expected control, domination, demands masked as marital rights. Instead, she received something else. Respect? No, it had to be a trick, a mask before the reveal. Victor stepped back. "There's a bell by your nightstand. If you need anything, water, food, help ring it." She didn't answer, just nodded barely. He gave a small bow of his head, then turned, his steps quiet as he moved away. But before he vanished down the hallway, he glanced back once more. "You're my wife, Sophie," he said, "but I will never touch you unless you wish it." Then he disappeared into the shadows. Sophie stood frozen, the words lingering in the silence like perfume. She didn't know whether to trust them or him. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in her wedding dress, unable to bring herself to change. Her fingers moved slowly to the clasp on her bracelet, a gift from Clara, who had called it a symbol of duty. Sophie unclasped it and placed it gently on the table, as if shedding a shackle. The silence of the room pressed in. Her eyes wandered to the door. It was still slightly ajar. He hadn't closed it behind him. She walked over and pushed it shut, then locked it. Not out of fear, but because it was the only decision that still belonged to her. The night stretched on. Sophie couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening for footsteps, waiting for the creak of a door, the shift of shadows. But none came, just the steady hum of wind outside and the gentle crackle of firewood. At one point, she rose and wandered to the window. The vast garden outside was cloaked in moonlight. In the distance, the fountain bubbled softly, its sound barely reaching her ears. She hugged herself. She didn't cry. Not yet. But something was changing. She didn't know what. The house felt different than she expected. Not warmer, not safer, but quieter, less hostile. And the man she had imagined forcing himself on her was instead sleeping somewhere else, alone. Why? The question echoed louder than the fear. She returned to bed, this time sliding under the covers. She stared at the ceiling, the fire casting soft, flickering shadows across the ornate moldings, and then a knock soft, 2 taps, gentle. She tensed. Sophie. His voice came low, muffled through the door. I just wanted to say good night. She didn't answer. He waited a beat, then footsteps walked away. The silence returned. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt full of something new, not safety, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something she hadn't expected at all. Sophie awoke with the weight of silence pressing against her chest. It wasn't the silence of danger or dread, but of uncertainty. The kind that follows you into your dreams and lingers in the corners of your thoughts when you open your eyes. The fire had died down, and the scent of lavender remained, clinging faintly to the sheets like a memory that didn't belong to her. The first morning as Mrs. Langley, she lay still, trying to remember if it had all truly happened. The wedding, the long drive, the locked door, Victor's voice, calm and careful, echoing through the wood. You're my wife, but I will never touch you unless you wish it. It had sounded too humane, too different from everything she expected. Still wearing the silk nightgown a maid had laid out on a velvet stool, Sophie rose, washed her face, and brushed her hair in silence. She avoided her reflection in the mirror. She didn't recognize the girl looking back anyway. A knock on the door startled her. Breakfast is served, madam. A voice called softly. Sophie hesitated before replying. I'll be down shortly. The dining room was massive. Walls of deep oak, oil paintings of stern-faced Langleys, and a chandelier that sparkled like it knew secrets. But it wasn't the room that surprised her. It was the man seated at the head of the long mahogany table, Victor, dressed in a charcoal gray sweater and black slacks, no suit, no tie. His silver-streaked hair was still slightly damp, as if he'd only just come from the shower. A newspaper was folded neatly beside his plate, untouched. The scent of fresh coffee and eggs filled the room, but he wasn't eating. He was waiting for her. Sophie walked in slowly. Their eyes met, and something in his gaze flickered. Not heat, not hunger, but something gentler. Something human. Good morning, he said, rising slightly from his seat. It wasn't the act of a master greeting a servant. It was a man acknowledging the presence of someone he respected. Sophie nodded, her voice soft. Morning. He gestured to the chair to his right, not at the opposite end of the table, not far from him, but beside him. She sat. The butler appeared silently and poured orange juice into her glass. Sophie's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for it. I hope you slept well, Victor said, cutting a piece of toast but not lifting it to his mouth. I did. Thank you. She surprised herself by answering. They ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable, not the way she feared. It was spacious, like he was giving her room to breathe, room to exist. After breakfast, Sophie rose. Unsure of what to do next, she braced herself for instructions, rules, expectations, perhaps a schedule to follow, but instead, Victor stood too and walked with her to the hallway. I'll be at the office most of the day, he said. Feel free to explore the house. There's a library, gardens, music room if you play. She blinked. You don't want me to do anything? He tilted his head slightly. You're not here to serve, Sophie. You're here to live. That stunned her more than anything else he could have said. Later that afternoon, she wandered into the library. It was a grand, quiet room with a fireplace, dark wooden shelves lined with hundreds of books, classics, biographies, poetry, and even some well-worn novels with cracked spines. She selected one, Wuthering Heights, the copy older than her by decades, and curled up in the leather armchair by the window. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, she felt her mind begin to breathe again. Hours passed. A soft knock interrupted her reading. Sophie looked up, startled. Victor stood in the doorway, holding 2 mugs. May I come in? She nodded slowly. He stepped inside and handed her a cup. Chamomile. You looked absorbed. I didn't want to startle you. Sophie accepted the mug, still warm. Thank you. He sat across from her, not too close, not too far. The fire crackled between them, a comfortable distance. A thoughtful silence. "I didn't take you for a Bronte girl," he said, glancing at the book. "I didn't take you for someone who reads tea leaves," she replied, then froze. Did that sound rude? But Victor chuckled low. Warm. Surprising. It disarmed her completely. Sophie lowered her gaze, sipping the tea. The warmth of the mug soothed her fingers. The aroma relaxed her shoulders. For a moment, she wasn't the girl who had been sold. She was simply herself. "You're different than I imagined," she murmured. Victor's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. "That makes two of us." She looked up. "You don't seem like a man who needs a wife, especially not one chosen by someone else." He stared into the fire for a long moment. "There are things in my past I won't speak of today, but loneliness is quieter than people think, and colder." Sophie said nothing. He continued, "I didn't agree to this arrangement lightly. I wanted to say no, but when I saw your picture and then met you, there was something in your eyes, something honest. I knew you didn't belong to any of this. Not the deal, not the lies." Her heart clenched. "Then why did you say yes?" she whispered. He took a slow breath, eyes still fixed on the flames. "Because I thought I could protect you from them, from the people who sold you like an object. I didn't want to be another monster." Sophie's lips parted, stunned. She hadn't expected that answer. She hadn't expected any of this. The silence between them stretched again, but this time it was full with meaning, with something unspoken. He stood, leaving his cup on the table. "I'll let you read," he said gently. "Dinner is at 7 if you'd like to join." And just like that, he was gone. Sophie remained seated, the book forgotten in her lap. She didn't know what to think anymore. Victor Langley was supposed to be a man of power, distance, control. Instead, he was showing her something dangerous. Kindness, the kind that slips past defenses when you least expect it. The kind that makes you forget you're supposed to be afraid. And in that moment, sitting alone, tea cooling in her hands, Sophie wasn't sure if that was a comfort or the most dangerous thing of all. It started with the smallest things. A folded blanket left on the armchair where Sophie always curled up to read, the kind of gesture that didn't announce itself, that didn't demand gratitude, but lingered quietly like a soft breath in a silent room. The mornings passed in a rhythm Sophie didn't expect. She'd wake early, find the sun pouring through the high windows of her bedroom, and feel, for just a second, not trapped, not owned, but seen. Victor never barged into her space. He never knocked late at night. He never pushed. And yet, he was there in gestures, in silence, in noticing. One afternoon, as Sophie entered the garden through the west wing, she paused. A small table had been set near the fountain just for her, a single chair, a glass of lemonade with mint leaves, and a plate of her favorite biscuits, ginger and honey, the kind her mother used to bake when she was a child. She hadn't told anyone she liked those. Not here, but someone remembered. "Victor." She sat slowly, the cool metal chair warming beneath the soft sunlight. Around her, the flowers bloomed in perfect symmetry. Roses, lilies, and climbing ivy that tangled like poetry against the stone walls. The scent of jasmine floated in the breeze. For the first time since arriving, Sophie didn't feel like a ghost haunting someone else's life. She felt present, whole, not healed, but breathing again. That evening, she passed through the library and noticed something strange. A book, Little Women, had been moved to the center of the reading table, her copy, the one she brought from her childhood home and hadn't touched in weeks. It sat beside a cup of chamomile, still faintly warm. Her eyes drifted toward the hallway. Was he watching? Was he waiting for her to notice? At dinner, Sophie finally found the courage to speak. "You remember the ginger biscuits," she said softly, not looking at him directly. Victor, seated at the other end of the intimate dining table, glanced up, his expression unreadable, but his voice warm. "Of course, you mentioned them once, in passing. You were speaking about your mother. Her baking calmed you after nightmares." Sophie blinked. The memory surfaced. Yes, she had told him the night of the wedding when she was too afraid to sleep, too tense to cry. She had been rambling, trying to distract herself. She didn't think he was even listening, but he had been. "I didn't think you were paying attention," she murmured. "I always pay attention," he replied, lifting his wine glass. His gaze held hers for a second too long. Sophie's breath caught, but she didn't look away. Later that night, she lingered in the hallway outside the library. The door was ajar, golden light spilling into the corridor. She peeked in and saw him not reading, not working, just sitting by the fire, turning something over in his hands. It was a music box, hers, the one she kept hidden at the back of her closet. She stepped inside. "Where did you find that?" Victor looked up, surprised. He placed the music box gently on the table. "Your maid dropped it while organizing your things. It was broken." Sophie moved closer, heart quickening. "It hasn't played in years." He turned a small brass key, and the melody bloomed, soft, lilting, familiar, the lullaby her father used to hum. Tears pricked her eyes. "I didn't fix it," Victor said quickly. "I just had someone who could. I didn't want to invade your space." Sophie sat beside him, the fire warm against her skin, the melody wrapping around her like a memory. "I thought I'd forgotten this song," she whispered. Victor didn't touch her, didn't speak. He simply sat with her as the music played, letting the silence do what words couldn't. After a while, Sophie glanced at him. "Why are you being so kind to me?" His reply was slow, deliberate. "Because I know what it's like to live in a house full of people and still feel completely alone." Sophie looked away, blinking back the burn in her eyes. That night, as she lay in bed, the music still echoing faintly in her memory, she stared at the ceiling and wondered something she hadn't dared before. Could kindness be real, even here? The next day she found herself waiting for him at dinner, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to see him. She wanted to ask questions, to listen, to understand the man who, instead of taking what had been handed to him like a transaction, had chosen instead to see her. That evening, she stepped into the dining room early. The room was empty, the candles unlit. She crossed the space and placed a folded napkin beside his plate. Inside it, a note, just 2 words: "Thank you." She slipped away before he could arrive. But later that night, when she returned to her room, there was something on her pillow. A small white envelope, her name written in a hand both elegant and restrained. She opened it. Inside was a note, his words: "Kindness should never surprise you. You deserve far more than this." Sophie pressed the card to her chest, eyes closed. And for the first time since the wedding, she smiled, not for anyone else. Not out of politeness, but because something inside her had shifted, not all the way, but enough to make her wonder if hope, once buried, could bloom again in the unlikeliest of places, and what might happen if she let it grow. The air was heavy with the promise of rain. Outside the tall windows of the Langley estate, gray clouds swirled low, cloaking the sky in a melancholy veil. Sophie sat curled up in the library, legs tucked beneath her, a worn blanket draped across her shoulders. A storm was coming, but not just in the sky inside her, too. She had been staring at the same page for over 20 minutes, the words blurring into shapes, meaningless. Her mind wandered to voices long silenced, to laughter lost on back roads, to faces she would never see again. Her mother's perfume, her father's arm around her shoulder, the Sunday pancakes, the warmth gone, taken in a breath, a crash, a flame. She didn't hear Victor approach, but somehow his presence didn't startle her. She looked up slowly as he stood near the doorway, holding 2 mugs of tea, as he always did now, like a quiet ritual. His eyes, that familiar stormy gray, studied her face. "You're somewhere far away," he said gently. Sophie blinked, grounding herself back into the room. Yes and no. He crossed the room and handed her the mug. She wrapped her hands around it without thinking. The heat soothed her fingers. The silence between them was familiar now, safe even. "I lost my parents in a car accident," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. 7 months ago. Victor didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He sat beside her and waited, letting the silence stretch until she chose to fill it. "It was raining," she continued. "I was supposed to go with them that night, but I had an essay due. I begged to stay home. I was so worried about the grade." Her voice broke, but she didn't stop. "They never came back. And I kept thinking, if I'd just gone with them, maybe it would have been different. Or maybe we all would have." She didn't finish the thought. Victor's hand remained on his lap, unmoving, but his gaze had changed, darkened, sharpened not with judgment, with knowing. "I used to replay that moment over and over," she whispered. "The last thing I said to my mother was, 'Don't forget the snacks.' That's it. That's the final memory." A long silence followed. Then Victor spoke, and his voice was lower than she'd ever heard it. "I was 8 when my father told me I was a disappointment." Sophie turned toward him, startled. "He handed me a stock report," Victor continued, eyes fixed on the fire. "Told me I needed to understand what legacy meant, that feelings were a distraction, that empathy was weakness, He used to keep score not of love, not of time spent with me, but of wins, accomplishments. Sophie watched him as he spoke, his posture still straight, still composed, but his voice carried something cracked beneath its surface, something old. I spent my life trying to be what he wanted. I built an empire, bought everything he once said I couldn't afford. But no matter how much I achieved, it was never enough, not for him, not for me. Sophie whispered. Did he ever say he was proud? Victor's jaw tightened. No. Silence. Two broken pasts tangled in the same room, sitting side by side like shadows cast by the same light. Sophie placed her mug on the table and shifted slightly toward him. I always thought my parents would be there forever. I was soft because they let me be. I felt safe because they held me like I was the most precious thing. She paused. But after they died, I realized how little that softness meant to others. Clara didn't want warmth in her house. She wanted obedience. She made it clear I wasn't family. I was a debt in a dress. Victor looked at her, then really looked. I'm sorry, he said, and those two words from a man like him carried more weight than whole apologies from others. Sophie's throat tightened. She didn't want to cry, not now, not in front of him, but tears pressed anyway. I hated you, she admitted, her voice a whisper. Before I met you, I imagined the worst. I thought you'd take everything from me, my dignity, my choices. Victor nodded once. You had every reason to believe that, but you didn't, she added, looking at him, and that was the moment something shifted. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, his voice quieter than ever. You make me want to be different, Sophie. Her breath caught. I've lived a life of transactions, he continued. Deals, power plays. I've never had space for softness, but when I saw you, I didn't want to own you. I wanted to undo what they did to you. Sophie stared at him, heart thudding so loud she could barely hear her own thoughts. I didn't want to be saved, she said softly. I know, he replied. I just wanted to stop the bleeding. She reached for the blanket beside her, wrapping it tighter around her shoulders. Suddenly cold. Victor stood, sensing her retreat, but not offended by it. You don't have to speak about it again, he said gently, but if you ever do, I'll be here. As he walked toward the door, Sophie's voice rose, quiet, but certain. Wait. He paused. She hesitated, then said, Thank you for not filling the silence with advice or trying to fix what can't be fixed. He turned just enough for her to see the shadow of a smile. Sometimes, silence is the most respectful form of presence. And with that, he was gone. Sophia sat alone again, but it didn't feel like before. The room still held his warmth, his listening, and the fire flickered gently, like a heartbeat. She wasn't sure what would come next. But for the first time, the past didn't feel like a cage. It felt like the place where healing might just begin. The rain came in waves that night, a quiet, steady rhythm against the glass panes of the Langley estate. Thunder grumbled in the distance, not fierce enough to frighten, but enough to make the walls feel closer, the silence deeper. Sophie stood at the window in the hallway outside her bedroom, watching the sky split open in brief flashes of silver. Her fingers touched the cold glass, as if trying to feel the storm on the other side. Something about the rain always made her chest ache, the kind of ache that didn't have a name, only a weight. Behind her, the house had quieted. The staff had gone to their quarters, the lights had dimmed, but she couldn't sleep. The air in her room felt too still, too quiet. She turned, blanket wrapped around her shoulders like armor, and stepped into the hallway. Her bare feet moved silently across the wooden floor as she made her way toward the library. The doors were closed, but a thin line of light spilled from underneath. She hesitated, then knocked gently. No response. She pushed the door open slowly. Victor sat near the fire, one hand holding a crystal glass of something amber, the other resting on the arm of the leather chair. His eyes were closed. The firelight flickered across his face, softening the sharp lines, painting shadows beneath his cheekbones. For a moment, he looked tired, human, vulnerable. She considered walking away, but then his eyes opened. Couldn't sleep? He asked, voice gravelly from stillness. Sophie nodded, stepping inside. Storm? He asked again. She nodded once more. He gestured to the second chair by the fire, her chair now. In some unspoken way, she sat, drawing the blanket tighter around her body. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The silence was full, not empty. The fire crackled. Rain whispered against the windows. And in the spaces between the sounds, something fragile began to breathe. Sophie turned her gaze toward him. Do you ever feel like the rain remembers?" Victor looked over at her, one brow raised. She offered a small smile. "It's silly, but I always feel like storms carry echoes of things left unsaid." He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss her thought. Instead, he replied, "I used to think that, too." She looked down, her fingers brushing the rim of the mug she'd brought with her. Steam curled upward, carrying the scent of chamomile and honey. "I used to listen to it with my mom," she said softly. "We'd sit by the window and count the seconds between the lightning and the thunder." She said it was the sky thinking before it spoke. Victor's lips twitched into the faintest smile. "That's beautiful." Sophie leaned back in the chair. Her body relaxed in increments, each breath loosening something knotted inside her. Her gaze shifted to him again. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "I thought you'd treat me like I was part of the deal, an acquisition, something to own." Victor held her gaze. "That was never my intention." "I know," she said. "Now I know." A beat of silence, then another, and then, without thinking, without planning, Sophie stood. She crossed the small space between them, her hands trembling slightly beneath the blanket, and paused beside his chair. Her eyes flickered over his face, the fine lines near his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way he studied her like a man trying not to move too quickly. "May I?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He nodded once. She lowered herself beside him, not in the chair, but gently on the edge of his. Their shoulders touched. The contact sent a flicker through her chest, but not of fear, warmth, real, present, steady. Victor didn't move. He didn't reach for her. He simply let her lean into him, slow and cautious, until her head rested against his shoulder. She could feel the heat of his body through his sweater, the rise and fall of his breathing, the faint scent of cedar and something earthy, something that smelled like quiet. "I don't know why I came," she murmured. "Yes, you do," he replied gently. She closed her eyes. He didn't ask questions, didn't shift or tighten. He allowed the silence to speak for them both. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket. She wasn't sure how long they sat like that, minutes, maybe longer. The storm outside grew louder, lightning streaking across the sky in flashes that lit the room like memories. And yet, in that small corner of the mansion, everything was still, everything was safe. She could feel the moment his breathing slowed, the way his body relaxed beneath hers. He was letting her in not just into his space, but into the parts of himself he didn't show to the world, and she let herself stay. For once, she didn't feel like a prisoner in silk. She didn't feel like a pawn in someone else's game. She felt like a girl sitting beside a man she no longer feared, a man who made space for her pain, a man who listened more than he spoke, a man who, for reasons she didn't yet understand, never crossed the line she couldn't name, but always stood near it, waiting for her to decide when. Sophie's head slipped slightly lower on his shoulder. She felt his arm shift just enough to steady her. She didn't pull away. She didn't want to. Not tonight. The fire popped gently. Outside, the thunder rolled again, not sharp, but distant now. The storm had softened, and in the quiet that followed, something else took root, not love, not yet, but something close. Something that made her wonder what the morning would feel like after this night of stillness, something that made her ask herself in silence. Was this the beginning of trust, or the edge of something deeper? The house slept. Every hallway, every chandelier, every polished floorboard was silent, blanketed in the hush of midnight. But inside Sophie's room, darkness was alive, not with shadows or sound, but with memory. It started quietly. A flicker behind her eyes, a whisper of rain on asphalt, the metallic twist of a steering wheel, screams swallowed by the wind, then impact, glass shattering, tires spinning, her mother's hand reaching, and then nothing. Sophie's body jolted. She gasped, sitting up in bed, her chest rising and falling in ragged sobs. The sheets were tangled around her legs, soaked with sweat. Her hands trembled as she clutched her own arms, trying to ground herself, trying to breathe. The nightmare had returned, more vivid than ever. She pressed a hand over her mouth to muffle the sounds escaping her broken, childlike, raw, but it was too late. The door burst open. "Sophie." Victor's voice cut through the panic like a wire through glass. He was already crossing the room, barefoot, shirt undone, eyes scanning her like a man bracing for something worse. "I'm sorry," she whispered between sobs. I didn't mean to wake you." He didn't answer with words. He dropped to his knees beside the bed, hands hovering for a moment, unsure, respectful, until she nodded once. Then he wrapped his arms around her, not tightly, not possessively, but firmly enough to hold the pieces together. Sophie broke. She collapsed into his chest, burying her face in the curve of his shoulder, her tears soaking through the fabric of his shirt. He said nothing, just held her, just let her cry. His hand moved gently along her back, slow, steady, like tracing invisible words of comfort. He didn't know how to speak aloud. "You're okay," he whispered. "You're safe." Sophie clung to him like the world had gone underwater. "I saw them," she choked, "the way they looked back at me. I should have been with them. I should have." "No." His voice was low, firm, but never sharp. "Don't carry that. They died, thinking I didn't love them enough. Sophie." He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. His thumb brushed a tear from her cheek. "They knew," he said. "They knew. Love like that doesn't vanish in a moment, and it doesn't die with the body." Her breath shook. "I'm so tired of feeling alone," she whispered. "You're not alone," he said, and the certainty in his voice startled her. He wasn't trying to save her. He was standing with her. It made all the difference. She looked at him. Really looked. His face was close, not too close. Just enough. His hair was slightly disheveled, his jaw unshaven, and in his eyes there was no distance, no wall, just a man fully present with a woman who hadn't known safety in months. He reached for the blanket and gently tucked it around her shoulders, never breaking eye contact. She hadn't felt this held since the funeral, since everything went dark. "I didn't think you'd come," she admitted. His lips curved into the faintest smile. "I told you I'd be here." A single tear rolled down her cheek. Victor caught it with his thumb, but this time his fingers lingered. His palm cradled the side of her face, warm. Still, she didn't pull away. Her hand lifted slowly, unsure, and rested lightly over his. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "So am I," he said. "But I'm more afraid of watching you go through this alone." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was everything. They remained like that. Close, quiet, breathing together in the half-light of her bedroom. The storm from earlier had passed, but its echo remained in her chest. She didn't ask him to stay, but he stayed. He moved to sit at the edge of her bed, back against the headboard, and she leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, their bodies curved like two puzzle pieces, finally finding a fit. And in that position, surrounded by warmth, by the faint scent of cedar and sleep, Sophie finally closed her eyes again, not because the pain was gone, but because someone was there to hold it with her. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, she didn't know. She only knew that when her breathing evened and her body began to soften into rest, Victor's hand was still in hers, no pressure, no demands, only presence. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't fall asleep out of exhaustion, but out of peace. Yet, even as sleep wrapped around her, one question remained, soft, quiet, but pulsing beneath her heartbeat. Why does this man, who owes me nothing, care so deeply? The morning after the nightmare arrived like a quiet apology, soft light slipping through pale curtains, the air still, the world holding its breath. Sophie stirred slowly, the weight of a steady arm across her waist anchoring her to the moment. For a second, she forgot where she was, and then she remembered. Victor, his warmth, his presence, the way he had held her through the storm of memory without asking for anything in return. He was still there, not asleep, but still, awake beside her, silent, his breathing deep, and even, she didn't move, afraid the spell might break. Her head rested just below his shoulder, and she could feel the beat of his heart, strong, steady, real. He was so close, and yet not imposing. She had never known a man like this, one who waited, one who listened, one who didn't try to fix her brokenness, but chose to remain near it. Slowly, she lifted her head. Victor looked down at her, eyes soft, unreadable. "Morning," he said, voice low and husky from hours of silence. Sophie managed a small nod. "You stayed?" "Of course." She sat up gently, wrapping the blanket around her. He didn't reach for her. He didn't even shift. He just watched her with a gaze so steady, so quiet, that it almost hurt. "I should get dressed," she whispered. He nodded, rising without a word. At the door, he paused. "I'm here, Sophie. That doesn't change." And then he was gone. The day passed slowly. Sophie wandered the gardens in silence, her steps thoughtful, her hands brushing the edges of blooming roses. Her mind played the night over and over. The way his arms had felt, the softness in his voice, the steadiness of his touch. Her heart was a mess of confusion. Could she be falling for him? Was that what this was? No. Yes. Maybe. By evening, she was restless. She walked the hallway outside his study 3 times before stopping at the door. Her hand hovered above the wood. She knocked once. "Come in," his voice answered. Calm. Sophie stepped inside. Victor stood by the fireplace, sleeves rolled up, drink untouched on the table beside him. He looked like he hadn't moved in hours, and yet something in his eyes told her he'd been waiting. She didn't sit. He didn't ask. "I don't know what this is," she began. "Between us, I don't know what to do with it." He didn't speak, only listened. "But I know how I feel when I'm around you," she continued, "and it's confusing and terrifying." Victor walked toward her slowly. "Sophie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you don't owe me anything, not gratitude, not affection, not trust. If what you need is space, I'll give it to you. If what you need is time, I'll wait." Her eyes filled with tears. "That's not what I need," she said. "I don't want distance. I just don't know how to do this." He stopped in front of her, only inches away now. "You're already doing it," he said. "You let me in." Her lower lip trembled. "Why are you so gentle with me?" "Because I love you." The words landed between them like thunder, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Sophie blinked. "What?" Victor stepped closer. "I love you. I tried not to. I didn't expect to. But the way you carry your pain, the way you hold on to your dignity, even when the world strips everything else from you, the way you never ask to be rescued, even when you're drowning." He took her hand. "I love you, Sophie, not because I'm supposed to, not because you're my wife by contract, but because you are the strongest, softest soul I've ever met." Tears spilled over her cheeks. "You shouldn't say that," she whispered. "You don't know what I'm still hiding." "I don't care," he said. "Whatever you're carrying, I want to help carry it." Sophie's chest tightened. Her entire life, love had been conditional, measured, earned. But this was something else. She reached up slowly and rested her hand against his cheek. "I don't know if I love you the way you love me," she admitted. His expression didn't change. "I only know that I feel safer with you than I've felt in my entire life, and that when you're near, I forget I was ever afraid." He closed his eyes for a moment, letting those words wash over him. Then he opened them again. "That's more than enough." They stood like that, inches apart, breath shared, hearts exposed. Sophie leaned in slowly, her forehead resting against his, and there it was not a kiss, not a touch, but something deeper. A moment suspended between past pain and future possibility. "I don't want this to end," she whispered. Victor responded, not with words, but by wrapping his arms around her in the softest, most certain embrace she had ever known. Not rushed, not hungry, just present, and in that stillness, she knew this was no longer survival. This was the beginning of something real, something that might just last. But even as she melted into his warmth, one question lingered at the edges of her heart, quiet, insistent, and still unanswered. Was she ready to let herself be truly loved, or was she still too afraid to let go completely? The mansion no longer felt like stone and silence. Something had shifted, not in the walls, but in the spaces between them. It began with sound, a soft piano melody drifting through the halls in the late afternoon, not played by a master, but by hesitant fingers rediscovering courage. Sophie's hands trembled the first time she touched the keys in the music room, but Victor had simply leaned against the doorframe and listened, never interrupting, never judging. Then came scent, warm cinnamon drifting from the kitchen, lavender lingering in the bedrooms, fresh roses arranged in vases that had long stood empty. Sophie had wandered into the kitchen one morning, barefoot and shy, and asked the chef if she could bake. The woman had blinked, startled, then smiled. Now the staff whispered about her when she passed, not with disdain, but with wonder. She greeted them by name. She smiled with her eyes. She asked questions, remembered birthdays, paused to compliment a bouquet or a clean floor. Her presence, once ghost-like, had become sunlight through heavy curtains. The house noticed, so did Victor. One evening, as he returned from the city, briefcase in hand, he paused in the foyer. The scent of lemon scones filled the air, and laughter echoed faintly from the drawing room. Sophie's voice, light and alive, teasing the gardener about the roses that refused to bloom. Victor stood still for a moment, just listening. Then he closed his eyes. He had bought this house decades ago, furnished it, maintained it, protected it, but he had never once thought of it as a home until now. Sophie's fingerprints were everywhere, not literal, but felt. The blanket on the armchair by the fire, folded just the way she liked it. The mug in the kitchen with the chipped rim she refused to replace because it had character. The stack of books by the window seat, poetry mostly, and a half-finished sketchbook filled with garden flowers she was trying to draw. Victor didn't say much about these things, but he noticed every single one, and more than once, he found himself smiling alone in a room she'd just left. One morning, he found her in the library, sitting on the floor beside the fireplace, reading to one of the maid's daughters, a girl no older than 10, eyes wide with curiosity, fingers clutching a stuffed rabbit. Sophie's voice was soft, animated, wrapping the child in story and wonder. Victor stood in the doorway, unnoticed. He didn't interrupt. He just watched. And something in his chest, something long dormant, stirred. Later that night, as they sat together by the fire, Sophie leaned into him, barefoot, her legs curled beneath her. She wore a soft gray sweater that belonged to him now, or maybe to them both. Her hair was undone, cascading over her shoulder. He reached up and gently tucked a strand behind her ear. "You've changed everything," he said quietly. She smiled, without looking up. "No, I just added a little life to what was already beautiful." He shook his head. "No, Sophie. I had walls and furniture. You gave it soul." Her gaze softened, and then she said something he hadn't expected. "This place used to feel like a palace I wasn't allowed to live in." He tensed slightly, but she reached for his hand. "Now it feels like a nest, a warm, safe place I want to wake up in." Victor brought her fingers to his lips, kissed them softly. She didn't pull away. He held her hand against his chest for a long moment. The fire crackled. The wind moved outside. Inside, everything was still, peaceful. In the days that followed, routines formed without being spoken aloud. Sophie would leave little notes on his desk, a flower sketch, a quote from a book, a line from a song. He would respond with bookmarks in her novels, slips of paper with dinner reservations, or her favorite chocolate resting on her pillow. They passed each other in the halls with glances that held more than words. They dined not like strangers fulfilling a duty, but like companions sharing something sacred. The staff began to smile more. The house felt warmer, and one night after dinner, Sophie surprised him. She stood in the middle of the ballroom, barefoot, wearing a navy dress that swayed just below her knees, and held out her hand. "Dance with me." Victor hesitated. "I haven't danced in years," he said. "I haven't either." She smiled. "We'll be clumsy together." He took her hand, and under the glow of a forgotten chandelier, they moved not perfectly, not smoothly, but fully present. His hand on her waist, her cheek against his chest. The music came from nowhere, or maybe just from the rhythm between them. When the song ended, they didn't move. Sophie looked up at him, her voice barely above her breath. "Sometimes I forget where I came from when I'm with you." Victor lowered his forehead to hers. "And sometimes I forget who I used to be." That night, as they walked the halls in silence, Sophie stopped near one of the tall windows and glanced out at the garden. The moonlight painted silver paths through the ivy and roses. "I never imagined this," she whispered. "This? Us?" Victor didn't answer right away. He slipped his fingers through hers, held them tightly, and as they stood there, watching the moon trace shadows through the trees, one thought stirred between them, unspoken, but deeply felt. If a mansion can become a home, could this love become forever? The house was silent, but it wasn't sleeping. Not tonight. Soft light spilled from the hallway sconces, and outside, the sky held its breath beneath a pale moon. Inside the master bedroom, time bent, seconds stretched, minutes vanished. Pain, breath, trembling hands, everything converged in one sacred moment. Sophie gripped the edge of the sheets, her face damp with sweat, her body trembling beneath the rhythm of something primal, unstoppable. The contractions had begun at dawn. Now it was past midnight. 12 hours of breathless pain, of holding on to the sound of Victor's voice, of letting go of every fear she once had, every wall, every scar, every memory of not being wanted. They had all melted the moment she felt the first stir of life inside her womb. And now that life was about to arrive, Victor sat beside her, his hand gripping hers, knuckles white. He hadn't left her side, not once, not when the midwife told him to take a break, not when the nurse asked him to rest. He had simply looked at Sophie and stayed. "You're doing so well," he whispered, brushing her damp hair from her forehead. "I can't," she gasped, squeezing his hand. "I can't anymore." "Yes, you can," he said, his voice steady, eyes shimmering. "You already are. Just a little more, Sophie. I'm right here." Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from the pain, but from the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing that had ever mattered. The midwife's voice was steady. One more push. He's almost here, Sophie cried out. Body arched, strength drawn from a place she didn't know existed, and then a sound not hers, not his, a cry, high-pitched, urgent, impossibly small. Sophie collapsed back into the pillows, sobs racking her body. But this time, they weren't from fear. They were from release, from awe, from something so sacred she couldn't name it. Victor didn't move at first. He was frozen. The midwife lifted the tiny wriggling form and turned to him. A boy, she said. He stepped forward, hands trembling. When she placed the child into his arms, something in him broke open a dam inside his chest that had held back too much for too long. He looked down at the baby, pink-skinned, fists clenched, eyes tightly shut, and his breath hitched. He has your mouth, he said softly, almost to himself. Sophie smiled weakly, eyes glassy. And your stubborn brow. Victor walked to her, still cradling the child. He lowered himself beside her and placed the newborn against her chest. Sophia sobbed it. She touched the baby's cheek, traced the line of his jaw with the tip of her finger. He's real, she whispered. He's perfect, Victor said. She looked up at him. He was crying silent tears slipping down the face of a man who once believed he was incapable of softness. I didn't know I could feel like this, he said. I didn't know love could be this complete. Sophie reached for his hand. He took it instantly. They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them wrapped in warmth, in breath, in the kind of silence that isn't empty, but holy. Later, when the midwife had cleaned up, when the room had dimmed again, and the baby lay sleeping in a bassinet by the window, Sophie watched Victor. He stood beside the cradle, unmoving. She spoke softly from the bed. You've changed. He turned slowly. I didn't know who I was until tonight. Sophie smiled. You're a father. He came to her, sat on the edge of the bed. And you, he said, brushing her hair gently, are the strongest person I've ever known. She leaned into his touch. I was terrified, she confessed, of all of it. But then I saw you hold him. And I forgot everything else. He kissed her forehead slow, reverent. No one ever gave me a family, he said. You gave me one without asking for anything. Her eyes shimmered. You already gave us everything, she whispered. Protection, peace, love. They sat in silence again, listening to the steady breath of the child sleeping just feet away. And in that room, once cold, once cavernous, there was now only warmth, the kind of warmth that turned stone into sanctuary. And yet, even as the night wrapped around them, one thought pulsed beneath Sophie's quiet joy. Now that they had everything to lose, would love be enough to protect it? The sky outside the Langley estate was painted in soft hues of lavender and gold, the sun sinking slowly behind the hills, as if reluctant to leave. The evening air was quiet, the kind of stillness that only followed moments too sacred to be touched. Inside, Sophie stood by the window, arms wrapped around her waist, gaze fixed on the garden below. From this height, the roses looked like scattered rubies in the dusk, their petals shivering slightly in the breeze. Behind her, the soft rustle of footsteps. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. Victor moved with a presence that no longer felt cold or guarded. He came to stand behind her, his arms gently circling her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. Their son slept just feet away in the cradle by the fireplace, swaddled in pale blue and breathing, in that peaceful rhythm known only to newborns and angels. Sophie leaned back into Victor's chest. I used to watch the world from behind glass, she whispered, always on the outside. Even when I was surrounded by people, I never felt part of anything. Victor's arms tightened around her. And now? He asked softly. Now, she said slowly, I feel like I've stepped inside the life I used to only imagine. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he kissed her shoulder, a slow, lingering press of lips that wasn't about desire, but reverence. I spent most of my life chasing the wrong kind of legacy, he murmured. Buildings, empires, control, but none of it meant anything. Sophie turned in his arms to face him. Her fingers brushed the side of his face, that familiar angle of his jaw, the silver in his hair that caught the light like stardust. And now? She asked, echoing him. His voice dropped to a whisper. Now I only care about the two hearts that beat in this house with mine. A silence stretched between them, full, golden, alive. Then Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of old paper, worn at the edges. He handed it to her. Sophie opened it slowly. It was a note, her handwriting, scribbled months ago. one she had left tucked between the pages of his book when she was still learning how to exist in his world. "Thank you for not breaking me." She looked up at him, eyes glassy. "You kept this?" "I carry it with me every day," he said. "It reminds me of who I never want to be again." Sophie's voice trembled. "You never broke me, Victor. You rebuilt me, piece by piece, word by word." He cupped her face, thumbs brushing the corners of her mouth, and said the words that had lived inside him for too long. "I will spend the rest of my life protecting everything we've built you, our son. This home, you gave me more than I ever dreamed I could have." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "And you," she whispered, "you gave me back to myself." He kissed her then, not with urgency, but with promise. It was a kiss that said, "I'm not going anywhere," that said, "You are my future," that said, "Everything I am belongs to us now." When they parted, Sophie rested her forehead against his. "I used to wonder if love like this was real," she said, "and now I know it's the only thing that ever was." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other, as the fire flickered behind them and their son dreamed softly in the cradle nearby. The walls that once echoed with emptiness now held laughter. The rooms that once felt cold now breathed warmth. And the man who once lived in silence now knew the sound of love spoken in every quiet gesture. But even as they held one another, Sophie's thoughts wandered just briefly toward the horizon, not out of fear, but wonder. Because if love could rise from where there once was nothing, what else might still be waiting for them just beyond the dawn? They said I was ruined. They said no one would ever want a girl like me, young, orphaned, used as payment for someone else's debts, a girl without choice, without voice, without a place to belong. And for a while, I believed them. I believed I had been sold into silence, that my life would be a series of shadows, elegant ones, perhaps, gilded in gold and wrapped in silk. But shadows all the same. I believed love was something reserved for those who had never been broken. But then he looked at me not with desire, not with pity, but with recognition, as if somewhere beneath the weight of what they'd done to me, beneath the pain I carried like a second skin, he saw someone worth choosing, not because I was beautiful, not because I was his, but because I was still here, still breathing, still brave, still whole, even in the pieces. That was when everything began to shift. He never tried to save me. He just stood beside me while I found the strength to save myself. He gave me silence when the world was too loud, space when I needed air, presence when I thought I was alone. And slowly, the girl they tried to erase returned. I didn't just survive. I softened. He trusted. I loved. And now, when I walk through the halls of the house they once forced me into, I no longer feel like a prisoner in a palace. I feel free. Because I learned something no one ever told me before. Love isn't always fireworks. Sometimes it's the sound of steady breathing beside you in the dark. Sometimes it's tea placed quietly at your door, a blanket over your shoulders, a note in the margin of your favorite book. Sometimes love grows slowly, not in a spark, but in the warmth that lingers long after everyone else has left. And that kind of love, it doesn't demand. It builds, it doesn't shout, it stays. To the girl out there who thinks her pain disqualifies her from happiness, to the woman who is told she is only valuable when she's useful, to anyone who's been discarded, silenced, or sold, you are not ruined. You are not unlovable. You are still worthy of a beginning that doesn't hurt. If you are in the middle of a night you think will never end, let me tell you I was there, too. And now, I have a son whose heartbeat reminds me that new life doesn't just come in tiny bodies. It comes in second chances, in healing, in the choice to open your heart again, even after the world taught you to close it. So, if you're listening to my voice, know this. You are allowed to hope again. You are allowed to love again. And even if the story they wrote for you started in pain, God still has the final word, because what was meant to destroy me became the beginning of the purest love I've ever known. And I believe, with all my heart, the same can happen to you. Not every love story begins with flowers. Sometimes it begins with loss, with a contract signed without a soul, with a yes spoken out of obligation, and a heart full of fear. Sophie was sold, negotiated, forced, but instead of finding a prison, she found a home. Instead of being touched out of duty, she was respected in silence, and when she least expected it, what was a gilded cage transformed into the place where love blossomed. This story reminds us of something the world tries to make us forget. True love doesn't demand. It waits. It doesn't shout. It stays. It doesn't impose. It builds day by day, gesture by gesture, silence by silence. Now I ask you, how many times have you walked through dark places thinking nothing could grow from there? And it was precisely there that God began a miracle